Hi all, Adi here from Hunts & Johns. As always, thank you so much for clicking on the video. I'm in deepest, darkest North Wales and I'm at a place called Beaumaris Castle. Apart from the fact that it never got finished, which we will learn about as we go around, I don't know very much about it. It has a lovely moat and it's very picturesque, so let's go and have an explore. If you've ever looked at pictures of Beaumaris Castle, you might think you're looking at the perfect medieval fortress. It's symmetrical, surrounded by water and packed with towers, and it looks almost too ideal to be real. But here's the interesting thing: despite looking complete from a distance, Beaumaris Castle was actually never finished. So how did one of the greatest castles ever designed end up incomplete? Well, to answer that, we have to go back more than 700 years, to a time when kings were trying to conquer entire countries. Rebellions were common, and castles weren't just homes, they were military machines. And Beaumaris Castle sits on the Isle of Anglesey, which is in North Wales, overlooking the Menai Strait. Today it's a peaceful place where visitors can wander the walls and towers, but in the late 13th century this was one of the most strategically important locations in Britain. The story begins with King Edward I of England, and he was sometimes known as Edward Longshanks. Now, during the 1270s and 1280s, Edward launched a series of military campaigns to conquer Wales. Whilst previous English kings had claimed authority over Wales, Edward intended to bring it fully under English control. And the final blow came in 1282 when the Welsh Prince Llewellyn, apologies if I've said that incorrectly, was killed. By the following year, organised Welsh resistance had largely collapsed, and Edward had achieved what no English king before him had managed. He had conquered Wales. But winning battles was only half the challenge. Holding onto the territory was something else entirely. Edward understood that castles weren't simply defensive buildings. They were symbols of power, centres of government, military bases, and reminders to the local population of who was in charge. So he commissioned what became one of the most ambitious castle building programmes ever undertaken in medieval Europe, and this network included castles such as Conwy, Harlech and Carnarvon, and eventually Beaumaris, and you will find other videos on my channel from Conwy and Harlech Castle. The man responsible for designing many of these incredible fortresses was James of St. George, and he was a highly skilled master mason and military architect from Savoy in what is now part of Switzerland. By the time work began on Beaumaris, James had years of experience building castles for Edward and was arguably at the height of his career. Construction started in 1295. And the timing wasn't a coincidence, because just the year before, Wales had erupted in a rebellion and several English castles came under attack, and Edward realised that Anglesey needed a powerful new fortress to secure English control. And there is the statue of the Master Mason. However, there was one big problem with the plan. The chosen site was already home to a Welsh settlement, so Edward ordered the existing Welsh population to move about 12 miles away to Newborough, and in their place a new English town was established beside the castle. Now, this was a deliberate policy. English settlers were encouraged to move in, whilst the native Welsh were largely excluded from living within the town walls. And the name Beaumaris comes from the Norman French, meaning beautiful marsh, referring to the marshy ground on which the castle was built. And building such an enormous castle really was an astonishing undertaking. At the height of its construction, more than 2,000 workers were employed here. there were stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, labourers, quarrymen and carters, and they all worked together to transform the marsh into one of the most sophisticated castles of the Middle Ages. Now, huge quantities of limestone were brought in, while timber arrived from forests across North Wales. Food, tools, iron and other supplies arrived constantly, much of that by sea, making use of the castle's excellent waterfront location. Edward spared little expense, well, at least at first. Beaumaris was designed using what's known as concentric defence, so rather than relying on a single curtain wall, the castle has two complete rings of walls. An attacker who somehow would have managed to breach the outer wall would have immediately found themselves trapped between two defensive lines while defenders attacked from above. It was an incredibly effective design. The outer walls are lower but filled with towers and firing positions, and behind them stand the taller inner walls, creating overlapping fields of defence. Every angle was carefully planned to minimise any blind spots, and many historians describe Beaumaris as the most technically perfect example of concentric castle design ever built. The gatehouses were masterpieces in themselves. Any visitors entering the castle would have had to pass through multiple heavy gates, portcullises, murder holes and thick wooden doors, so any attacking force would have faced a series of deadly obstacles before reaching the courtyard. As we saw on the way in, the castle is surrounded by a broad water-filled moat, and it's one of the most impressive surviving medieval moats anywhere in Britain. And another particularly clever feature was the dock known as the Gunner's Walk or the Sea Gate, and that allowed supplies to arrive directly by ship through a tidal entrance straight into the castle. So even if an enemy surrounded the landward side of the castle, they could still potentially continue to receive food and troops, equipment, etc., provided English naval control remained secure. Although inside the walls things looked a little bit different, because some of the grand buildings you'd expect to find inside a royal castle are missing, and that's because they were never completed. Edward's original plans had included lavish royal apartments, a great hall, kitchens, chapels, etc., and many of the foundations for these were laid, but much of it simply never happened, and the reason comes down to money, because building castles on this scale was unbelievably expensive, and Edward's campaigns in both Wales and Scotland were draining the royal treasury, and by the early 1300s attention and funding had shifted elsewhere. Construction slowed dramatically, and although work continued in fits and starts for more years, by around 1330 Beaumaris remained unfinished, but around £15,000 had already been spent, and that was a staggering sum for the medieval period. But despite never being finished, Beaumaris still proved useful, and in 1403, during the Welsh revolt led by Owen Glyndwr, the castle was besieged, and I know I will have mispronounced that, apologies. So this rebellion represented the last serious attempt to restore an independent Welsh principality during the Middle Ages. After that, the castle gradually became less important on a military scale, but advances in artillery meant medieval castles were becoming increasingly vulnerable, and by the 16th century many castles across Britain were falling into disrepair, and Beaumaris was no exception. However, it would once again find itself caught up in conflict during the English Civil War in the 1640s. Initially, the castle was held for King Charles I by royalist forces, but later troops captured it after a siege. And unlike some castles which were deliberately destroyed after the Civil War to prevent future military use, Beaumaris luckily escaped complete demolition, but even so, parts of the interior buildings continued to deteriorate over the following centuries, and by the 18th century artists and travellers had begun to admire the romantic ruins, and the rise of landscape painting and tourism meant castles like Beaumaris then became popular destinations valued not for military strength but for their beauty and history, and fortunately preservation efforts began before the ruins deteriorated too far so they couldn't be saved. So in the early 20th century the castle came into state care, and conservation work has continued here ever since. And today Beaumaris Castle is managed by Cadw, I think that's how you say it, which is the Welsh Government's Historic Environment Service. Today it's also part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site known as the Castles and Town Walls of King Edward in Gwynedd, alongside those other castles, Carnarvon, Conwy and Harlech, and together these castles are recognised as some of the finest examples of late 13th and early 14th century military architecture anywhere in Europe. But one of the most enjoyable things about this beautiful Beaumaris Castle is just how much access you have. As you can see, I've climbed the towers, walked around battlements, explored gatehouses and looked across the moats just as defenders would have done centuries ago. Even unfinished, it's remarkably easy to imagine how imposing it must have appeared to anyone approaching from land or by sea, and there's also a certain elegance to Beaumaris that's different from many other castles. I mean, Carnarvon often grabs attention with its colourful stonework and beautiful towers. Harlech impresses with its dramatic cliff-top position, and Conwy dominates the town around it. But Beaumaris is almost mathematical in its precision. Everything feels balanced. The layout is remarkably symmetrical, giving historians a rare glimpse into what medieval military architects considered close to the ideal fortress. Ironically, the fact that it was never finished actually helps us understand medieval construction techniques, because archaeologists can now see foundations and incomplete sections that would otherwise have been hidden beneath later buildings. It almost looks like you're looking at a giant architectural blueprint frozen in stone. So while the castle never fulfilled Edward I's original vision, it remains one of the greatest castles ever built. It's a monument to ambition, engineering, politics and medieval military thinking. It tells the story not only of English power in Wales but also of Welsh resistance, the enormous human effort and the staggering resources medieval kings were willing to invest to secure their kingdoms. And more than 7 centuries later, those great walls still stand beside the Menai Strait. The moat still reflects the towers. The unfinished courtyards still invite visitors to imagine what might have been. And perhaps it not being finished is part of what makes Beaumaris so fascinating. It isn't simply a castle that survived history. It's a castle that tells the story of plans that were interrupted, ambitions left incomplete, and a remarkable piece of medieval engineering that remains one of the finest examples of castle design anywhere in the world. I'll wrap the video up here. I do hope you enjoyed my visit to this beautiful castle in North Wales. If you did, if you could please like, subscribe, hit the hype button, and if you want to, hit the notification bell, and that'll let you know when I've uploaded a new video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye for now.